Now it's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Professor Bonnie Newsom. I began learning about Bonnie's innovative work when she was a Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Penobscot Nation at the same time as she was doing her PhD at UMass Amherst. I knew she'd completed her undergraduate and graduate master's degrees here, but it wasn't until she returned to UMaine as an assistant professor in anthropology that I had a pleasure to get to know her. And after her return, Bonnie and Alice Kelly in the School of Earth and Climate Sciences began collaborating on a research project designed to help communities preserve shell heaps along the coast with all the indigenous history that they contain, and to protect them from sea level rise, which we know better than ever is a big threat, not the only threat that they face. They gave a great talk about their work right here in 2019, and you can find out more about that work by going to visit our YouTube channel and listening to part of the title is Racing the Clock to Preserve the Past. And by the way, some of that work was also featured in the New York Times. Today, we're going to hear about an amazing new project that Bonnie and her colleagues are leading with a $30 million grant from the National Science Foundation. I first heard Bonnie talk about this extraordinary collaboration last fall. I was stacking firewood, which I do every fall, on the show On Point. And ever since I heard that talk, I probably emailed her within 24 hours. She was a little bit busy in the fall, but here she is, thankfully, to share more of the great work that she and her colleagues are doing. Please join me in welcoming Bonnie back to the Mitchell Center.
Nil Lewis Bonnie Newsom, Naga Panwab Scow Nil, Naga Nudalkit Nil, Edjiwili Dahazi Bemkiskak. I greet you all in Penobscot language. I'm a citizen of the Penobscot Nation. I'm also an archaeologist, and I also said I'm very happy for this day. Chi-Willy-Wan, great thanks to the Senator George Mitchell Center for inviting me to speak today. I'm thrilled for the opportunity to share with you the Center for Braiding Indigenous Knowledges in Science, or what we refer to as CBIKS. And this, as David mentioned, it's a new NSF-funded Science and Technology Center at the University of Massachusetts Amherst with regional hubs all over the world, and including here at the University of Maine. So University of Maine is at the Northeast Hub. So today I'll cover these 5 topics. I'll start with a brief introduction to the new center, and then I'll provide a theoretical overview of what we mean by braiding knowledges. I'll then share with you some details on the structure and components of CBIKS, and then I'll discuss some of the impacts and transformative potential of the center. And finally, I want to close with by sharing our team's vision for the future, or what we call our victory circle. So let's begin by introducing you to CBIKS, or the Center for Braiding Indigenous Knowledges in Science. So the center is actually a new science and technology center funded by the National Science Foundation and based at UMass. NSF's Science and Technology Center program supports both innovative, complex, and transformative research and education projects that require large-scale and long-term investments. NSF funds science technology centers for a period of 5 years, and with the possibility of renewing the award for a subsequent 5 years. So in September of 2023, NSF identified CBIKS as one of 4 new centers to fund, and those other 3 centers are listed here, and these are the 4 new ones in the United States. I want to point out that we do have an international component with CBIKS, but the funding for that, much of that international work is coming from UMass Amherst. NSF doesn't typically have pots of money for international work. So this is a pretty significant initiative, and it's a $30 million award, and it's uniquely significant for several reasons. For one thing, CBIKS is the first and only Indigenous-focused science technology center NSF has ever funded. And it's the single largest NSF investment in Indigenous science, making it really the most substantial investment in Indigenous science that we know of anywhere around the world. Also, CBIKS is the first science technology center grounded in the social sciences. In other STCs, we see a lot of emphasis on what we call the hard sciences. And those are things like particle physics, quantitative cell biology, X-ray lasers, and all of those kind of hard science topics. To have an STC dedicated to Indigenous science, combined with its social science focus, is really groundbreaking. And so it's something that has never happened before. And this is also the largest grant that the University of Massachusetts has ever received in the campus's history. So I want to point out also that NSF recognizes that Indigenous knowledge, such as traditional ecological knowledge, and Indigenous science practices through an Indigenous lens are considered science. And this is really groundbreaking. And oftentimes Indigenous knowledge was marginalized or neglected. And so this is something that is an effort to move Indigenous knowledge into mainstream science practices. So the location, or CBIKS Central, is located at UMass Amherst, and they have dedicated a 4,000 square foot building to house both staff and faculty, as well as graduate and undergraduate students. They've also dedicated a central space for a traditional teaching lodge that we are, as a CBIKS team, we're going to construct in May, and this will get reconstructed every year. And this traditional teaching lodge is built on a model of either a longhouse or wigwam, designed for outdoor education and Indigenous-led instruction. And it's a space where we envision students emerging as leaders in Indigenous science. So CBIKS has a global team that includes predominantly Indigenous scientists. In total, we are 54 investigators, and we specialize in climate and environmental sciences, Indigenous knowledge systems, archaeology, science ethics, education, museums, and heritage. And many of these scholars are one of only a handful, or even sometimes the only Indigenous person in their field. And as such, many of us have faced some isolation in our career paths. And CBIKS' origin story really begins with all of the scholars, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, who work to develop methodologies of knowledge co-production, ethics guidelines, practices of bringing together Indigenous and Western science in a world where Indigenous knowledge has often been either marginalized or neglected. We currently have research partnerships with 54 Indigenous communities around the world. And this does not represent all of the communities that CBIKS will eventually work with. Our aim is to continue to grow our outreach and partnerships with Indigenous communities over the life of CBIKS. The center is designed to really facilitate cross synergies where we all learn with and from each other across disciplines to braid our individual specialties and experience together. And so CBIKS really began with all of us dreaming of healthy Indigenous futures and a different future in which a strong interconnected network of us around the world can come together and work towards creating a different way of viewing science. Relationships among team members and community partners have evolved over decades. Many of the folks you see here have been doing this kind of work for a very long time. And in our first year, we have added both graduate students and postdocs, broadening that circle of people who have experience and interest in working to braid Indigenous knowledge and science. And this is really, for students, this is really a place where Indigenous knowledge is valued and normalized as part of the research process. I need to pause for a moment and acknowledge Dr. Sonia Atalay, who is the lead champion for this initiative, and she acted on an email from a colleague that forwarded the NSF request for proposals for an STC. And on a whim, she reached out to an NSF program officer and who advised her that a social science center was certainly possible, and one focusing on Indigenous knowledge was certainly possible. NSF simply doesn't get social science proposals very often. And so Dr. Atalay opted to develop a proposal and reached out to other Indigenous scholars that she had relationships with already in her network. And that's outreach included us here at the University of Maine. I got my PhD at UMass Amherst, and I knew Dr. Atalay from that period of time in my life. And so she reached out to me and John Daigle and Darren Ranko as well. So this slide just shows the leadership team as well as the co-leads of the Northeast hub of CBIKS, and UMaine is the administrative center for the Northeast hub. And I'll talk a bit more about the hubs and CBIKS's organizational structure in a bit. As I mentioned, Sonia is an Indigenous archaeologist at the University of Massachusetts and lead PI. She's also director of the center. John Woodruff and Addie Rose Holland are at UMass as well, and they bring their experiences with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Center to the leadership team. Aura Martinez is at Northern Arizona University, and Allison Wiley is at University of British Columbia, and she's really our ethics person. They're all part of our leadership team. We also have a PhD student on our leadership team, recognizing the value of our future generations in leadership positions. So what exactly does CBIKS do? Well, our grand challenge is to effectively and ethically braid Indigenous knowledges in Western science together to address significant climate change challenges, care and protection of archaeological or cultural places, and food security at local and global levels. Climate change and its effects are experienced disproportionately by Indigenous communities. Lands and places cared for by Indigenous peoples are some of the most biodiverse on Earth, due in large part to the traditional knowledge and practices used by Indigenous communities to steward their homelands. And these knowledges have emerged over millennia through observation and ecological engagement. Mainstream science often silos study of climate change, heritage spaces, and food systems, Whereas Indigenous peoples share common philosophies of their interconnections. And we selected those 3 areas of focus because they were priorities among the communities that we had worked with. We cannot silo these topics and expect to be successful in solving related societal challenges. Complex and interconnected adaptation solutions are essential for healthy and resilient communities and for the health of our planet. CBIKS addresses these grand challenges using holistic and transdisciplinary approaches and engages with these topics in a very interconnected way. Our research objectives really emerge from our vision and mission, and we use insights from local community identified projects to develop generalizable braiding methodologies and to train new generations of scientists, as well as Indigenous communities, resource managers, and government agencies. And the hope is that we will begin to see a mainstream change where these braided methods begin to transform how science is done. CBIKS's vision looks forward to 2033. Remember, this is a potentially 10-year project. And after a decade of CBIKS, we see a world where braiding Indigenous knowledge in Western science is really at the forefront of scientific inquiry, particularly within these topic areas. We see an enhanced workforce of students, scientists, Indigenous communities that have skills and training in how to conduct and apply braiding methodologies in these focus areas and beyond. We see really a greater equity through connections, improved quality of life through enhanced climate change and mitigation planning, improved care for our homelands, public lands, food systems, and cultural heritage. Our long-range research goals are to better understand the details and nuances of effective and ethical braiding methods in specific Indigenous homelands, ultimately leading to improved and more ethical scientific research in knowledge co-production frameworks. CBIKS has the potential for long-lasting impacts in the practice and ethics of science, and these will, we hope, will continue to grow beyond us and beyond the 10 years of work that CBIKS is planning on doing. Indigenous peoples have thousands of years of knowledge and experience that have prepared us for 7 generations approaches that are necessary for CBIKS's research. As Indigenous scholars, we understand this to be our sacred responsibility, and we plan according to a 7 generations model, or 230 years or so. We no longer have the luxury of time to continue ignoring or disregarding Indigenous knowledge systems, and we need to bring our best collective thinking to bear on research connected to healing our planet and society. And now's the time to use these braiding methods to adequately address urgent challenges that are really impacting us all. So what exactly do I mean by braiding? Well, at the core of CBIKS is this concept of bringing knowledges together through a braid. And I'm going to spend a little time on what we mean by that in the context of CBIKS's research. We draw heavily from Mi'kmaq Elder Albert Marshall's concept of two-eyed seeing. Marshall described this as learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of mainstream knowledges and ways of knowing, and to use both of these eyes together for the benefit of all. Two-eyed seeing is a pluralistic approach that positions Indigenous ways of knowing in a place of equity with mainstream or Western science. And this figure, published by Reed and colleagues, details the flow of knowledge based on researchers' understandings or views of reality, and ultimately guides research and management decisions. So you'll see the status quo model here on your left illustrates a one-eyed seeing approach. And in this approach accepts Western science as really the sole valid knowledge system, thereby producing a singular understanding that informs decisions. And this model was really generated or created to address fisheries management and other natural resources management. The knowledge assimilation model in the center is an approach whereby researchers seek to improve understanding by bringing Indigenous knowledges to inform scientific inquiry and decision making. And you'll notice Indigenous knowledge here, and that gets assimilated to a one-eyed seeing approach. What happens in this case is that Indigenous knowledge becomes subsumed within the Western science knowledge space, and the decision-making is still with just that one eye or one lens. Now, both of these single-eyed models can unfold in alternate ways, where Indigenous knowledges in decision-making is the priority. So you can flip this and not integrate Western science in a way that's not equitable as well. So the graphic on the right is the two-eyed seeing model, and this is knowledge coexistence. And this shows what Reed and colleagues, this shows the model where Indigenous knowledge and Western science contribute equally to scientific inquiry and as well as management decisions. And they do this in parallel and produce a mutual understanding from which decisions are formed. And in this final model, each way of knowing is valued equally, and each maintains its integrity. So Indigenous knowledge doesn't get consumed or subsumed under another model of interpretation. So as we at CBIKS built on this two-eyed seeing model, CBIKS is motivated by the central question of how do we bring these disparate ways of knowing, Indigenous knowledge and Western science, into right relationship with one another for mutual benefit of our environments and cultures. At a time of accelerating environmental change and complex overlapping challenges, we need a plurality of perspectives to innovate solutions. And we really find it helpful to think of CBIKS research components using the braid metaphor, with the braid being comprised of three bundles of knowledge. Community-held Indigenous knowledge that is collected from around the globe, local place-based research findings, and the co-creation of generalizable meta-level methodologies for knowledge integration. And these strands are interconnected and essential for achieving CBIKS's vision and mission. But note in the diagram that the braid is made up of many strands. And this is because braiding is built into everything that we do at CBIKS: research, education, outreach, science. And the metaphor and practice of braiding applies to both the research process, as well as the anticipated outcomes. And, this approach is inherently transdisciplinary. It's holistic and deeply rooted in understanding that we will learn so much more when these strands are braided together. The length of the braid functions a bit like a timeline, representing where we have come from and how we envision the work of CBIKS in supporting a future where science is done differently. We mark a starting point when Indigenous knowledge was the dominant epistemology here in North America and elsewhere. And after all, Indigenous peoples have always been scientists and applied that science to flourish and adapt through climate changes. CBIKS acknowledges and honors the science of our ancestors and builds upon it. And we acknowledge that the enterprise of colonialism to erase and replace sought to erase that Indigenous knowledge and replace it with non-Indigenous thinking. And this created an intellectual monoculture and therefore a blind spot for most Western scientists who were taught only their kind of science and their history. Indigenous knowledge was largely invisible. There was no braid, only a single strand or a one-eyed view. So CBIKS is transforming that narrative. And thanks to the efforts of many scholars before us, there's now a critical mass of Indigenous scientists and scholars with both the vision and capacity to transform how science is done. And Indigenous knowledge is increasingly recognized and valued and engaged as complementary partners, as a complementary partner to Western science. And what we're doing is we're using knowledge from our Indigenous past to address today's climate change challenges for the well-being of our descendants and 7 generations forward. We see education as a key factor in ensuring that braided approaches to scientific inquiry will become mainstream. And this table shows the nearly 17% decrease over a decade in the number of Native American graduate students in STEM fields, in contrast to the increasing number of STEM graduates for other populations. CBIKS was designed to alleviate longstanding isolation among Indigenous scholars and to have a positive impact on these statistics. As an entity, CBIKS offers an intellectual, international, and transdisciplinary community of practice that simply has not existed on a scale and scope of this level previously. And we center Indigenous participation with the aim of addressing these statistics. Yet our deliverables and our outputs are designed to be inclusive and to ensure that the mainstream acceptance of braided data and methods. CBIKS really provides an opportunity to intervene at a critical time of need when Native students and Indigenous peoples and communities who are at the forefront of climate change can advance so that our lands and traditional lifeways aren't altered by climate change anymore, really. So I'm going to shift now to talk about CBIKS structure and how we are organized. And there are 3 primary components to CBIKS. There are regional hubs, thematic working groups, and an online knowledge base that work together in interconnected ways to carry out our mission. CBIKS has 8 regional hubs located around the world, and hubs are co-led by research teams, and they carry out place-based transdisciplinary research on climate change, heritage places, and foodways. Additionally, CBIKS has 7 working groups, and they use qualitative methods to research the braiding process that is used in hubs. And working groups, their work really deepens understanding of the process of scientific knowledge co-production. And then the third component is a publicly available knowledge base that curates and organizes and shares methods, ethics, syllabi, best practices for how to braid mainstream science and Indigenous knowledge. And this provides students and scientists and communities access to what we learn together at CBIKS. And really, we hope that it will enhance our climate change planning in care of tribal homelands, as well as public lands, cultural heritage, and our food systems. So this is kind of a diagram that shows the 3 areas of CBIKS, and we use the basket as a symbol for how we do this work. And through this, we view each of these as integrated activities that CBIKS as a collective collaboratively constructs. And as research is carried out, the interwoven base of this basket, which includes, let me see here, which includes these our regional hubs, as well as these thematic working groups, builds up and out. And then the goal is for the basket to actually hold the knowledge base, where information that is generated through these processes is made available for a broader public. CBIKS's 8 regional hubs are listed here, and each carries out community-based research. So for example, here in Maine, we are working with the tribal communities in Maine. Indigenous knowledge is developed and sustained across multiple generations who really engage with particular environments. And therefore, we believe that CBIKS core research must be place-based, locally developed, and grounded in specific Indigenous homelands. CBIKS research requires this community-based approach, meaning that projects emerge from community-identified needs, and community members are involved in the research. And all of this work kind of occurs at the hub level. Our hubs are co-led by 17 scientists across diverse disciplines. And this co-lead model really follows Indigenous models of mentoring and intergenerational learning. Some have native and non-native co-leads, others pair senior and junior scholars, and the mutual mentoring model is designed for partner-based work and effort so that nobody carries the work alone. And so that's one key component of CBIKS, is that we share responsibility for carrying out this work. Every hub also trains undergraduate and graduate students and Indigenous community partners, building a significant workforce that is skilled in these braiding methods. And each hub also supports elders, fluent language speakers, and youth participation in our work as well. Research at the hub level includes different types of projects. So hubs can carry out what we call research foundations projects, and these really focus on setting research agendas with communities, developing research frameworks, creating Indigenous-led methodologies and ethical research protocols. In these types of projects, hub leads work with community partners and engage with the working groups to identify appropriate ways in which research foundations projects can braid knowledge throughout CBIKS and beyond. The second type of research project carried out at the hub level is the place-based study. And these projects focus on fieldwork-based research in areas of climate change, cultural places and foodways. And like the Research Foundations projects, results and methods are braided across CBIKS with guidance from and interaction with the thematic working groups. And all hubs really work to grow their networks. And so our Northeast hub, we expect, will grow and collaboratively developed and propose new projects. The Northeast hub, as I mentioned, is at UMaine, but it includes other Northeast partners as well. And it's undertaking the Widawas-Duduk project, or to join in conversation. And this project is really designed to braid science, Wabanaki or Indigenous community needs, and Wabanaki ways of knowing and doing together to really inspire a more formal articulation of Wabanaki research paradigms and agendas. And so rather than research ideas coming from the university out to Indigenous communities, our vision is that those research ideas and priorities are generated at the community level and come to the university through CBIKS. And this ensures that Wabanaki needs and approaches are at the forefront of research planning and implementation. And this summer, we plan to carry out what we're calling table talks or listening circles with Wabanaki community members to begin to identify not only what Wabanaki research priorities and interests are, but how does research get carried out appropriately with and for Wabanaki communities. And these sessions are really designed to emulate Wabanaki collective thinking processes, which take place around a fire, in council chambers, or in a wigwam, for example. And we envision these sessions as indigenized versions of focus groups that move participants beyond being sources of qualitative data to partners in knowledge co-production, science discovery, research design, and project implementation. And these conversations at the community level allow for this free flow of ideas and collective approaches to identifying research priorities and needs. And we see this as a decolonizing strategy designed to facilitate systemic change in science research and communication at UMaine, with a broader goal of creating a model for other Indigenous communities and institutions to emulate. So in addition to our Research Foundations projects, hubs also carry out place-based studies, and we anticipate funding 35 place-based studies in our first 5 years. And this table shows the 6 studies that are being initiated this year across CBIKS. And they range from topics related to cultural use of sockeye salmon, to mapping environmental indicators of climate change using traditional ecological knowledge. And you'll see some other kinds of place-based studies that are occurring in CBIKS's first year. And each project works to braid Indigenous knowledges into all aspects of planning and carrying out the research. So as an example of a place-based study, I'll share some details on the Pacific Northwest Hub Year 1 study that Dr. Marco Hatch, who is the co-lead of the Pacific Northwest Hub, is conducting on what are called clam gardens. And so beginning about 3,500 years ago, Indigenous peoples on the Pacific coast created an enhanced clam habitat and production by building clam gardens. And clam gardens are created by rolling large rocks to the low tide line to terrace a beach similar to how you terrace a hill in agriculture. And beaches were terraced to grow more food, and clams that live in that soft sediment, and also other foods that live in the rock wall, provide a resource for community members. And so these features actually provide easy access, predictable and abundant shellfish, and other species that have served as staple foods for coastal communities in the Northwest. And these clam gardens exist from the state of Washington all through coastal British Columbia and Southeast Alaska. And currently there are less than 200 identified clam gardens, and there are likely thousands more, but that's a gap that needs to be filled. In this project, the braiding process involves integrating multiple themes. The image on the upper left is of contemporary Swinomish clam garden construction. So contemporary peoples are actually drawing from this ancestral technique to address climate change and food issues today. And they've identified reinvigorating clam gardens as a way of adapting and mitigating sea level rise, while also protecting these traditional food systems. Step 2 involves braiding Indigenous knowledge into the research plan and promoting data sovereignty. In this study, the team is working with Indigenous knowledge of clam gardens locations, and they are protecting those locations through kind of this Indigenous data sovereignty effort. Team members, this step 3, team members integrate culture in all aspects of what they are, all aspects of this project, including they start their day in a culturally appropriate way, beginning with culture before delving into the science. And this is a traditional basket that they're using, and so they also are mindful of some of the cultural practices that go along with collecting clams. And then delivery or outputs are also part of the process as well. Dr. Hatch's team is using Indigenous knowledge mobilization to share research results, and this is just an image of him presenting at a Coast Salish gathering. And this is the largest gathering of Coast Salish nations across the US-Canadian border. And the goal here is to share the research with a broader community, and specifically Indigenous communities more broadly. So throughout CBIKS, the hub-generated research is complemented by thematic working groups, and each working group focuses on understanding a key step of the Indigenous research project. So you'll see themes like relationality, data sovereignty, fieldwork practices. And so these working groups are co-led by Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars with specialty in these areas. And they're there to really help us at the hub level identify what is emerging from the hub research that can be shared more broadly. And so thematic working groups are really crucial in kind of bringing all of this together. And they'll distill these key lessons from place-based studies to produce generalizable methodology and ethical guidelines to research. I'm just going to move ahead a little forward, talk about the knowledge base. CBIKS' third component is an online knowledge base, and it's represented what we will envision as a complete basket. And it's a central place where we curate and hold research produced by scholars and community partners, both within and outside of CBIKS. And scientists and communities can both contribute and draw from our anticipated knowledge base. It will be publicly accessible and will include key outputs of our research programs, including things like syllabi, reports, research analyses, data sets, all of which is vetted through a community process. So communities only share what is appropriate to share, and they will know what is going into this knowledge base for others to draw from. So I'll now highlight some impacts and some anticipated transformations that we expect to arise from CBIKS research. The scope and structure of, as you can see, the scope and structure of CBIKS is pretty complex. Our research objectives are ambitious, but they have great potential for transformative impact at 3 scales. At the local scale, hub projects and studies will address urgent climate change challenges facing Indigenous communities. At the meta level, working groups will strengthen our understanding of how to engage in knowledge co-production and build expertise and capacity to ethically apply methodologies from the local scale to other places and homelands without being exploitative. And at the global scale, CBIKS is poised to really catalyze a long-term research area and will launch new and sustainable research communities of practice around braiding knowledge. And we envision this as being connected across the globe. Our hope is that CBIKS's legacy will expand across generations as current and future leaders address and solve problems within their communities and beyond. Before closing, I want to share with you a few of our key year 1 accomplishments, keeping in mind we've only been in operation since September, and so it's taken a little time to get us up and running. I'm pleased to say we're almost fully staffed, and hopefully by this time next year, we'll be churning out quite a bit of research. That's what we're hoping for. One of the things that we did early on was we wrote an intellectual property agreement for CBIKS partners that states that for all knowledge shared for all universities going forward, I think, in terms of how we deal with Indigenous intellectual property. And so rather than having an individual scholar or the university own the IP, the knowledge that's produced and the local community's knowledge is retained at the community level. The rights are retained at the community level. We've developed an Indigenous management plan, which really I've talked about is a co-lead model for all hubs and working groups. We have a leadership circle that is intergenerational and includes elders and youth in every phase of our decision making. It also includes Indigenous language speakers and knowledge carriers. We include the ancestors in our management, asking in our decision making, what would our ancestors do, or how would they handle this situation? We have a visual note-taking team at CBIKS, recognizing that not all of our broad publics can consume the kinds of things that come out of academia in a way that is accessible. And so we use arts and visuals as a way of recording knowledges. And this is something that Indigenous peoples have always done to record and pass down knowledge, whether through petroglyphs or birch bark etchings or paintings on hides. And so we contracted with a company called Depict out of East Hampton, Mass. And they record all of our meetings in this way through visual note taking. We have our standard notes, but this actually allows us to take pieces or the image in its entirety and use it as a tool for messaging, similar to how our ancestors may have communicated in the past. So for our victory circle, I'm going to just want to close here. In December of 2023, we engaged in a participatory planning process and during what we call our winter gathering. And as part of our visioning process, we considered what does success look like for CBIKS and what knowledge are we sending forward into the future? And we positioned this within this 7 generations thinking model. And so we asked ourselves questions like, what are healthy Indigenous futures that we hope to grow into existence with each other? And so thinking about that and coming up with a collective voice on how we are going to move forward with CBIKS is part of what you see here. This is a narrative that was, Dr. Robin Kimmerer is part of our team, and she co-leads the CBIKS Fieldwork and TEK Thematic Working Group. And we asked her to share her reflection on our team's strategic planning. And she titled her reflection, "What Did We Hear?" And I'll just close with some of her words reflecting on our collective CBIKS work thus far. And she wrote, together, we imagine dancing in our victory circle where we want to hear celebration of the growth of a new generation of Indigenous leaders equipped with the skills of braiding knowledges. We want to celebrate creating a climate in which Indigenous knowledge systems are represented and valued in decision-making. We want to celebrate the spread of new narratives. We will cheer for tribal colleges when CBIKS models are part of each. We are dreaming of a way to decolonize scientific establishments, of self-determination for the time when we know ourselves as research leaders, not research subjects. And we will know we are successful when social and ecological well-being for land and people is the highest research reward. And so in closing, I just want to say, as a co-PI for CBIKS, I would like to thank you all for taking the time out of your day to learn about this new initiative. And I encourage you all to consider some of the same questions our CBIKS team is focusing on. Perhaps you might consider how to transform your research practice to centralize relationality. What practices would you enact as your protocols of care? What might braiding knowledges look like in your research, or how can you support others who are working to bring knowledge equity to scientific inquiry? And most fundamentally, how can you share your talents and skills to build regenerative science practices, care for lands, waters, and plant and animal relations, and ensure that we all dance together in a victory circle? So thank you. I will stop sharing. And I'm happy to take any questions.
So the good news is that was just an amazing talk, Bonnie. Thank you so much. We are a little short on time for Q&A, so if people need to leave to go to another class or anything else, feel free to do so, and same for the Zoom audience. But I see Mike.
Bonnie, this was wonderful. And that's part of what's been coming in terms of the comments about it. One person said, this is wonderful. How can individuals help support this great project?
I would say as individuals, I think probably the most important thing for individuals to do is rethink our value systems, to look at how we approach science and some of the climate change and other challenges in a more holistic way, and begin to think about how we as humans view ourselves within the greater sphere of our non-human relatives. So just begin thinking differently. I would say that's the best start, and support Indigenous scholarship for sure.
Thank you. Another question someone asked is about different concrete examples that they look forward to learning how braided in Indigenous knowledge looks in different concrete examples. And do you have any suggestions for how they might learn about that?
Yeah, so as an archaeologist, part of my work, I view my work as trying to understand Indigenous knowledges of the past and using those knowledges of our ancestors to inform our behavior today. So for example, we have the large Damariscotta shell heaps on the Damariscotta River in Maine. Well, what are some of the Indigenous practices or knowledges that contributed to management of those shell heaps or management of those resources over millennia, right? And what can we learn from that to help maybe shape our behavior today with regard to shellfish?
Great.
So that's just
Thank
off the
you.
top of my head.
No, that's good. That's good. People really found it instructive in terms of the images that you included throughout your presentation. The basket image to give a sense of the different parts of this important work and also how they're intended to come together. They found the braiding just so important, and where you said, well, the length of the braid is a bit like a timeline. Those kinds of interesting points, people really said that it really helped them in terms of thinking about things. Another question was, if we think about K-12 students,
Yes.
learning science, learning about this, do you have 3 suggestions about next steps of what we should think about?
Well, CBIKS has a really, and I didn't talk much about this, but we have a really strong educational outreach component. So we are actually creating units for K-12 or what we call knowledge bundles. And so we realize that teachers may not always be comfortable talking or teaching some of lessons that might be connected to Indigenous knowledge. And so we want to make it easy for teachers to be able to integrate Indigenous knowledge into their lesson plans. So yes, that is something I didn't touch on, but K-12 is very important. We actually have somebody on staff that's dedicated to that.
Great, great. One last one. I know we've gone over time, but there's so many things that people want to ask you. And here's one that says, thanks so much, Bonnie. I'm excited to hear about the new structure and projects. I'm wondering whether it'd be possible to connect work on sustaining Indigenous language and story practices with the braiding process you described.
Absolutely. I think all of us across CBIKS recognize how fragile and vulnerable our Indigenous languages are. So language preservation is a priority, and I envision us working through the 3 areas to help preserve languages. Just by having fluent speakers as part of our team is a step towards preserving languages. Story work is another piece that we are very actively involved in. In fact, we have plans for theater, a theater component to CBIKS, and some of the messaging around Indigenous knowledge and some of the results will come out for a broader public through these theater productions.
Thank you. David, there is one more, but I know you probably have some people in the room that want
Actually,
to
can you
ask.
hear me, Linda?
I
If you
can.
then go ahead and wrap that. Let's do that as the very last question.
Okay. So thanks for a wonderful talk. What a great project. Here at Arizona State, my collaborative governance lab group is interested in biocultural conservation as a way of governing the commons. And I'm wondering if you see biocultural conservation as a part of your work and whether you think biocultural conservation is something that can be co-produced or whether it's mainly to be considered in Indigenous ways of knowing.
Question. A lot of that is community specific, and so I wouldn't feel comfortable saying.
Yes.
Oh, well, I was just saying that those biocultural questions are probably better addressed at the local or community level, dependent upon the context.
Thank you.
Now let's, I'm sure this conversation could go on a lot longer, and if you're here and you want to ask Bonnie anything, come on up if she can stay. But for now, let's thank her again for great work. You've got a long way to go, and it's in good hands.
Yes.